How are we doing today, guys? So today we're going to be talking about the GHD movements. So specifically the sit-up, the back extension, and the side bend. We'll also talk through the GHD hip extension and the difference between that and the back extension. A lot of these movements are obviously focused around spinal control, and that's where the GHD probably shines as an actual tool and piece of equipment to use, is developing understanding about how to move the spine through ranges of motion. Now, quite often people are taught that the spine shouldn't move, that it should stay locked in, and you don't want it moving when you're doing things. And while kind of true in certain contexts, it's also a case of we want the spine to be able to move fluidly through its ranges of motion. And the stronger the spine is through a greater range of motion, the better it's going to be long term in terms of reducing chances of injuries. So we want the spine to move, and this is what this is all about. It's starting to tell it to move laterally, flexion, extension, out of flexion, into extension, out of flexion, and those sorts of positions. So that's what we'll talk through today. So first things first, we'll talk about the GHD sit-up, but we'll talk about how to set the GHD up first, or our particular one. Obviously know how to set yours personally up. To move ours, we've got the knob down the bottom as well as these two knobs up here. These two generally don't move, but they work the same way as this one. So all I'll do is explain this one, and that one can be fine. Generally, these need to be up near the top, but some drills will require them to be moved down for specific people, but generally we don't move them. So what we're looking for here is that you're going to unscrew this. From there, you're going to pull it out because it's on a spring. From there, you can easily slide the GHD forwards without much trouble. That's really, really easy. Because of the weight of the plate on this back side, it's actually quite hard to move in the opposite direction. So when we're trying to create movement back the other way, easiest way to do it is to hook a hand underneath this metal plate and then slide it backwards, and then it will actually slide relatively easily, and then you should get obviously the coil of spring popping that back in. Now, when we're setting this up for the GHD sit-up, we actually want it quite short. A lot of people will get back pain and discomfort through their spine when they're doing their GHD sit-up, and a lot of that stems from the fact that they're setting their hips on top of the mats here, and that means that the bony parts of your butt actually get locked into the pad because of the friction, which means your lumbar spine does a lot of that extension movement, which is quite excessive when we're talking about someone who's relatively short trying to get down to the ground there. So we want to be able to put it into a position that allows us to limit that and allows the hips to rotate and move freely. So sliding this forwards, so that for my case I only have 2 holes showing, but it's actually a lot shorter than what most people think and they feel. So when you jump up, what you'll notice is that when I have my feet hooked in, so for the GHD sit up, you're looking for obviously sitting on the pad, you've got your feet hooked in between the 2 pads. When I sit on that, you'll notice that my hips are well and truly hanging off the side. The pad at the top of the pad is sitting about center of my femur, my upper leg. And that's where you want it to sit, because what that allows us to do is to keep the knees bent as I come down, which means that my hips can extend fully and my back, it sits in within normal ranges, and I can very easily sit down to the bottom and touch the ground to get all the way down to full range. So we want to put this into a position where the back is not being put into an excessive range, because if I was to do the same thing where my hips were sitting up on top of this, and then I tried to move back, obviously with the foot resting in a different place, what you'd find is that because the hip bone is jammed into the top of the pad here, that the back has to extend significantly further, and that's where people quite often get back pain. So think about controlling these variables to make it as easy as possible, because that's probably the biggest #1 reason that people get back pain, just because they're not in a very good position and they're not putting their body into a good shape because of how the GHD is set up. Now, for the GHD sit up, we're obviously looking to create as much movement through the spine as possible, like I said earlier. The point is to go into extension and then to flex to get yourself back up. Now, how we do this, you want to be making sure that you keep a knee bend at all times. From there, it protects the spine and gives you space to move into later. So from here, I can flex through the back. I can then extend through the hips, extend through the spine to touch the ground. From that point there, I'm going to be thinking about pulling my rib cage towards my hips. So I'm going to flex my spine to shorten that leverage to then pull myself all the way back up. Now that's more of a strict based action. But you notice that the big thing is the spine extends and flexes. Don't try and hold a hollow as you're going down. Again, that's another one where I see people hurting themselves, is they try and hold themselves here the whole time. They try and force their hips to create that extension. And that's where, again, it just doesn't move. The body's meant to move and let the spine move. So if I do a strict variation, I'm going to come through, tap, and drive back up. Now by strict, I'm meaning that I'm not really utilizing any hips or knees to try and get that back up. The variations that you can use, so if I think about utilizing my knees, if I come down, I can snap the knees to pop myself back up. Now, using this variation will create a lot more engagement through your hip flexor because the rec fem is attached into obviously the top of the knee. So I snap that knee down, it's going to engage the quadriceps and the hip flexor of the rec fem to pull myself up. Takes a bit of pressure away from the abdominals. So if you're in a workout and your abdominals are fatiguing, snapping the knee can help. So if I give you two variations, there's strict, there's the knee snap, and that creates, can make it easier for some. The third variation is actually utilizing hamstrings. So I'm going to pull, and you're going to actually notice my knee flex more. That's going to create a flexion through the hamstrings. My tibialis, my toes, are going to pull up. That's going to use a lot of hip flexor as I pull through. So if I go down, I'm relaxed, tap, and then I'm going to pull myself back up to create that action. So those are all your three big variations for the GHD sit up. Different people will find that certain variations will feel more comfortable or less comfortable, dependent on which one works for them and how it feels. There's no necessarily right or wrong answer. It kind of depends on the context that you're trying to find while trying to use. Are you trying to target abdominals or are you trying to target hip flexors? So for like my soccer players, I'll use hip flexor variations a lot more than I'll use abdominal based ones, just because I want them to strengthen their hip flexors for sprinting. Whereas obviously the CrossFitters, typically we're trying to target the abdominals, so we're trying to build the abdominal strength. But again, it depends on the person, the context that you're trying to apply it to. Okay, so when we talk about when we want to travel into the next movement, so remember GHD sit ups, to recap, you've got your strict abdominals, you've got your knee snap, which is going to hit your hip flexors, and then you've got your hamstring pull in, which is also going to hit hamstrings and which we'll call hip flexors again. Basically, neutral knees, knee extension, knee flexion. If you think about those three different variations, you'll find they'll hit the different patterns. Practice all three, because all three are useful to cycle between different muscle groups if you're in the middle of a conditioning piece. Okay, next thing we're going to work on to is the side bend. That way we can discuss about the back bend and the hip extension together at the end. So side bend, you want significantly longer position on the GHD. So I'm going to unscrew, pull it out, grab onto the plate, and I'm going to elongate that out significantly further. So for this, you want most of the leg on this side, and you pretty much want the hip being on the top or just in underneath. So if I check that height, so top foot's going to go in the middle, bottom foot's going to go on the bottom, and then from there you want a slight knee bend when you're doing this. So this is actually pretty good for me. My hips are sitting pretty much on top or slightly on this side for me to be able to do that side bend. I'm deliberately going to sit my hips into the middle portion of these two pads. Main reason for that is it allows me to kind of lock my hips in a little bit. So the setup that we're looking for the GHD side bend, you want top leg in the middle, bottom leg underneath. From there, hips sit into the middle of the pad, slight knee bend because that just makes it a little bit easier to control forwards and backwards of the hip, because a lot of people find that fall forwards or fall backwards. So if you have a little knee bend, you have a little bit more control over that. From there, I'm going to elongate my abdominals, my side. So I'm deliberately trying to create as much side flexion as I possibly can. And it's going to be stretching all the way through the abdominals, the obliques, through the QL on that side, through the lat on that side. Now, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to create an equal contraction all the way through the entire side of my body. So we're talking about equal contraction through your obliques on the side, your QLs, your abdominals, and we probably want to limit lat a little bit in most people's cases because we want to try and get that engagement through the side of the body. So rather than thinking about trying to engage the lats, and this is where the arm position can be quite crucial, the arm position becomes, if you start moving through the arm too much, what you'll find is that the lat will take over and you won't be able to get much QL, which this is a really, really good way of drilling QL engagement. So rather than trying to utilize the lat, think about utilizing the QL, and I'll explain how. So when you come into it, elongate yourself down. Now, if I keep my arm relaxed in front of my body, it's significantly easier for me to get the QL, the back of the kind of that square muscle at the back of the body to engage rather than the obliques, rather than the lat. Whereas if I come through and I pull down with that lat, it's going to depress that shoulder and it's going to make it very, very much more lat dominant in the action. So basically when we're trying to control the engagement through the lats or not, think about your arm position and deliberately trying to create a little bit of elevation. So as I sit down, deliberately going to elevate slightly, contract into it, relax all the way back down again. So the other thing that we want to be thinking about is also forwards to backwards. So if a lot of people will lean backwards and will come up, it's going to make it a lot more abdominal based. If I lean forwards and then pull up, it's going to make it a lot more QL based or back based. Now, both have relevance, so if someone has a weak QL, getting them to lean forwards a little bit to get that back to engage a little bit more and work a little bit harder can be a good thing. If someone lacks a little bit through abdominal strength, they're sitting overextended all the time, then rolling them backwards and allowing the abdominals to take over can be a benefit as well. But in general, we want to sit side on. So if I demonstrate the full movement, what we want, sitting the hips square and upright. From there, fully lengthen down, elevate that shoulder slightly, compress as high as you possibly can, then back down. Elongate out, compress as high as possible, elongate back down, etc. And that's what you're looking for your side bend. Obviously, repeating that through the other side of the body to make sure that you're getting consistent positions, consistent shapes. Now, that's our side bend. We're going to progress into the back extension now. So, back extension is the final piece of the spinal complex. So obviously, we've trained from extended spine, or back being arched, to a flex position with the GHD Sit Up. We've just tackled lateral flexion, both left and right side going from extension to flexion. Now we're going to look at spinal flexion through to spinal extension. Now, to focus on the back, we're actually going to keep the GHD fairly lengthened out here. Now, the reason for that is it locks in the hips, which forces the spine to move. So, chucking the legs in. From there, you can really focus on getting the hips locked in and basically sitting on the two spikes on my hips. That's going to allow me to really focus on flexing my back and flexing my spine as much as I possibly can, to then allow me to extend as much as I can. And this allows me to focus on spinal extension because the legs are locked in place. They're going to be holding that shape, holding that length. We're not going to be focusing on what the hamstrings are doing because the hamstrings can't really move because the pelvis itself is already locked in place. So when you set this up, legs are locked in, hips locked on top. From there, the movement that we're looking for is deliberately creating flexion. Now, this means actually elongating the arms, so I'm trying to push my elbows away from me. From that point, from that flex position, I'm actually using the abdominals to pull my rib cage down into the pad as well. From that position, I'm going to deliberately try to extend my lumbar back. From there, I'm going to extend through my thoracic. I'm going to pull my shoulder blades back, and I'm going to extend through my neck to get that full spinal extension all the way up. and then I'm going to reverse that, flex the cervical, bring the upper back flex, flex through the lumbar spine, all the way back down. And obviously you'd repeat that. That's what we're looking for when we're talking about our back extension. And obviously you can add load to that by holding load in your hands, etc. Now, when we're talking about the hip extension, we want that position actually shortened right back down to where we had it for the GHD sit up, because we know that that's going to put it right in the middle of our thighs again. So if I get into this position, resting the knees on top of that GHD, sliding the feet in, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be deliberately elongating myself out. Now this will put a lot of pressure onto the quads. It will almost foam roll your quads out for you. It can be a little bit uncomfortable, particularly if you've done squats recently, or something similar to that. But by the same token, you get used to it, it's fine. And it's not going to be hurting you. From there, use the handles to then elongate yourself out and then hang down. Now what you will notice here is that when I'm hanging down, my feet are straight and I'm sitting on myself comfortably on that position. Notice how I'm using the handles to kind of reposition myself as I need to. Now from there, I can pull my tailbone back and I'm not being impeded by the pads. This allows me to lock my spine into place. From that position, it means that when I come up, I can flex and I can use my hips to create the entire action. My upper back does not shift. And that's how we isolate into the hamstrings and the glutes. Where people go wrong is that they use their spine to create the entire movement, and they'll sit and they'll extend through their spine rather than extending through the hips. So if you want to create a good hip extension, deliberately create flexion through the abdominals, flexion through the spine, and hold that flexion, because that's going to allow, it's going to force the hip forwards relative to the rib cage, and that's going to create a much better end range hip extension than any sort of spinal movement. The other thing is the feet. If you rotate the toes outwards as you're doing this, the glutes are already externally rotated, and as we've spoken about in other videos, external rotation through the glutes is not a good end range hip extension position. If you want end range hip extension, you want internal rotation. You want the toes being inwards. So toes pointing straight down to the ground or even slightly inwards are going to be a better benefit for you in terms of creating better end range hip extension. So get the toes right, get the legs right. From there, lower yourself down. From there, flex. From there, pull that tailbone back as you go down. That way the lumbar spine stays stable, and that allows the hips to do your entire movement. So those are our GHD variations. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you have any questions, flick us a message. Other than that, see you later.